What's up guys, Houndish here, and today I wanted to jump in and talk about Joker's Wild. Man, I thought this was Season of the Drifter. And yeah, that's definitely true. Joker's Wild just rolls off the tongue better, man. But that's an interesting thing in itself, isn't it? When we look at this seasonal model in the annual pass, Bungie have actually decided against these seasonal titles or DLC names, and that's something that they are kind of trying to move away from. Season of the Drifter much better describes a season of content updates and offerings to the game as opposed to a big DLC content drop, you know, like we had in Forsaken. I also think Bungie are trying to reserve the impact of DLC names for the future, right? You know, if we do get bigger content drops, they probably want that to be communicated very clearly. This is Forsaken. It's distinctly different to Black Armory or Joker's Wild. That's probably part of it as well. I know that was a bit of a random tangent, but anyway, back onto the subject. I want to give some thoughts about the initial launch of Season 6, the new content, and reflect on how some folks in the community are responding, because yes, Season 6 definitely comes with some of the more niche content that we've seen from an annual pass drop so far. So naturally, some folks are loving it, some folks are kind of mixed, and particularly because of the focus around Gambit content, there are some people that are giving this content drop a miss completely. So let's talk about it. But be sure to let me know how you feel down below. Mixed opinions is in the title of the video because I think it's very true, so be sure to let yours be heard as well. But as we get in and talk about the content, we should definitely speak about Gambit Prime. So of course, with the focus around Gambit, it's sort of a natural turnoff if you aren't a massive Gambit fan. Why do some people dislike Gambit? Well, I think the core reasons are probably the PvP element, maybe the competitive element as well, or particularly the mechanics around it, which do heavily favor coordinated teams. And of course, that can make it kind of difficult to play solo. And on top of this, for Gambit, I think some folks simply find it kind of repetitive. And if you aren't a huge Gambit fan, then I'd love to hear why in the comment section below. But whatever the reasons are, it does mean that Joker's Wild's core content is not going to satisfy as wide of an audience as Forsaken. And of course, as I've said before, we need to recognize the fact that the annual pass content drops are just that. They cost less than a quarter of the price of the full game, or a DLC when it comes to Destiny. However, at the time where many folks purchased the annual pass, they hadn't necessarily had time to really form an opinion of Gambit. So I can understand it being kind of frustrating for players who feel like there isn't much content really tailored to them. And it's something I totally relate to as well, because I have friends who are the hardest core Destiny fans going who aren't really playing right now whatsoever, so I feel like I have a decent sense of what folks are feeling. As we've mentioned though, Gambit is the core, but it isn't all of the content in Season 6, so we'll talk about that and some other issues with Destiny in general as well. But let's speak about what's good about Gambit Prime. I'd say that this is truly an evolution of Gambit. Some of the new mechanics actually make the mode much more interesting for me at least. You know, even having to take out 3 envoys in order to DPS is a neat addition, and while it makes the mode kind of more complicated, it also almost introduces more decision points and helps learnability in some respects as well. For me, being a bit of a derp at times, I love the fact that when we're taking down envoys, as that final envoy pops up, the first thing that I'm looking for is an enemy invade. And so that decision point is, do we get ready for DPS now? Do we wait out the invade and then start our DPS window? And it's interesting because these have always been decisions that you need to make in Gambit, but I feel like the way things flow in Prime are that bit more meaningful and engaging. There are some issues with the mode though. There have been a couple of bugs here and there. I think some of the primeval burns might need a look at, and personally I think invasion spam can be a little bit excessive at times. But again, for Gambit fans or folks enjoying the mode, because that's really who we're talking about right here, I think this is a very healthy expansion into the Gambit endgame. The Gambit Armor is a pretty interesting aspect that we haven't really fully experienced. The set perks and bonuses are going to have a significant impact on the way that Prime plays over the next week or so. And as I mentioned yesterday, for me personally, I'm not investing that much into tier 1 or 2 gear for me at the moment, because I feel like it's a lot of effort to spend a bunch of synths right now when I plan to spend all over again next week when we can finally get the best armor. So I do think the armor system, having 3 different tiers for each set, feels kind of weird to me and maybe to other players who want the top tier armor. However, I recognize that it means a lot more players get a taste of the gear and can acquire some of the really cool looking stuff, even if they're playing relatively casually. It feels like the system is fairly well laddered in terms of providing something for most types of players who are willing to play Gambit. On top of this though, while the new Gambit weapons aren't necessarily groundbreaking, I think they're really solid. Bungie brought us some new perks, they made some interesting combinations, and considering that the weapons are way less of a focus for this drop than Black Armory for example and the Forge weapons, I think we've done pretty well from the new legendary set. Of course, Reckoning is another addition here though. I almost wonder if some players could have gotten more out of a Reckoning endgame than a Gambit one. Although I do think Reckoning is pretty fun personally. There's a decent level of challenge there, and Bungie have created some neat kind of dungeon-like challenges to run, you know, do it flawlessly. There's some cool triumphs and emblems and stuff for it, and it's a good way to get some additional drops of the new weapons, as well as it being intrinsic, of course, to the armor upgrade system. Reckoning, as part of the Gambit ecosystem, I think is doing a really good job. Once again though, if that Gambit ecosystem isn't really interesting to you, then you probably aren't going to get overly excited about Reckoning either. There are a couple of issues with Reckoning. There's been a fair amount of complaining about conduct and match-made players in Reckoning, you know, people being AFK and stuff like that. There are always more things that Bungie can do to kind of protect against that. There's also the fact that you do have things like collectible objects in Reckoning, both before you enter the arena and inside, and while it's cooler to have collectibles hidden away than not, it certainly does serve as a kind of distraction if you have that guy running around in the starting zone as another guy in your team heads through and starts the event, you know? There will, however, always be some issues when it comes to match-made content, especially when it's somewhat difficult content, and to Bungie's credit, the problems that are highlighted in something like Reckoning with matchmaking are exactly why we don't have matchmaking in raids. At the same time though, I think adding more match-made endgame experiences is definitely a learning curve, and hopefully Bungie can take some useful data away. But on the subject of Prime, Reckoning, and the rewards, the armor, I think it's really important, even if you're not super hyped about Gambit or this set of armor, it's really important that set bonuses, which have been requested for a very long time, are now kind of on Bungie's radar. This is hopefully the starting point of a lot of very meaningful progression stuff that Bungie can do in the future, but of course apply to everything in the game, or to other major aspects of the game and not just Gambit. So that's where I'm at with Gambit. Personally, I'm having a lot of fun. I understand that not everyone is going to enjoy this stuff, and of course that does have an impact on how you're going to feel about this content drop in general. So be sure to let me know your thoughts about that stuff down below. But moving away from Gambit, let's talk about power progression and some other stuff. Power in particular is kind of being broken down into this seasonal model. Really the main reason to level up is to get into new content and eventually master it, but of course, 3 months later, we get this power increase again, and we're back into the loop of running through milestones and all of that stuff. I've definitely seen more frustration around power leveling this time, and I think part of it is about the value of that power level. And again, if you're not really investing into Reckoning especially, then there's not an awful lot to really power level for in the game in general, or at least any further than where we are right now. But also, there are complaints about having to rerun old content in order to make progress towards new stuff. And while I personally don't especially mind this, I can understand it feeling a little bit repetitive, but I think it isn't necessarily helped by the fact that Bungie now also have bounties, which can help players to catch up super quickly at the start of a season, right? Because for everyone who does invest into that, it feels a little bit like wasted effort to see it awarded to other players later without them making the same investment. Just want to say though, this isn't me having a go at anybody who has used those bounties to actually level up. Absolutely, you paid for the content and you should be able to play it, right? This is a Bungie design problem and not a player one. And on top of this, I think a lot of the complaints and legitimate issues are tied to the fact that we're progressing much more regularly right now. Power level will have increased up to 5 times in 1 year by the time we get to September, and I think that could be part of it, as well as the still kind of expensive economy. I'm going to say it again, I feel like Infusion, enhancement cores, all of that stuff still needs a look at. I don't like spending loads on Infusion, and would rather use that stuff to actually do the upgrades on gear, even when they're fairly minimal. I know lots of people in the community feel the same, so once again, any thoughts on the power progression system, Infusion upgrades, all of that stuff, would be super interesting to see in the comment section. But in terms of other stuff, while we don't have hefty cinematic story content, a lot of the lore that we've seen so far for Season 6, I think is pretty amazing stuff. The stuff we're getting in the lore books actually feels so much bigger than the drop of content itself that we're seeing right now. There are loads of hints to the future, conversations about the future of the Vanguard, the Drifter is teasing us of a giant universe-changing event coming in the future. There is a lot of really cool stuff there, and some of this ties into the new quest content, like the Vanguard Allegiance, for example. From what we've seen so far, it looks like this story here is going to be pretty amazing. That is if you're kind of invested into the lore in the way that Bungie are delivering at the moment at least. But in terms of how much progression things like the Allegiance quest will provide, well really they're kind of going to be somewhat one-off experiences, the same with the Thorn quest. I'm personally really looking forward to them, but in terms of what the Allegiance quest will mean, and any rewards that we'll get, we're still really playing a guessing game. As mentioned though, I do think they are somewhat one-and-done experiences, although Allegiance will apparently affect our story in at least some small way moving forward, so that sounds potentially really cool. It could mean some really cool things for the future. We are also going to get Invitations of the Nine, Again, I think the story could be really cool. Invitations will actually be a little bit of a longer term thing. We'll get new lore and story for 9 weeks, and the rewards could be kind of minimal, but really the best way to think about it is a Queen's Court style experience, maybe something that you do for an hour or so every single week. But if you are a fan of lore and story in Destiny, actually I think things are pretty interesting right now. So that's kind of speaking about the content that's on the roadmap. But to speak about the game in general and how it sits right now, of course Gambit has taken the focus for Season 6. We do have a less alternative PvE content for players to invest into. Folks do talk about the fact that there's no raid this time around, and interestingly it has been the first content drop in D2 which hasn't featured a raid, so certainly it's something that's missing for some players. Also, touching back on some stuff I spoke about in the community frustration video a few weeks ago, a struggle for PvP focused players is the lack of kind of PvP endgame at the moment. And previously, a fair while ago now, that did kind of take the form of trials, and we spoke about the positives of the comp playlist. But again, that comp playlist in Destiny at the moment, I don't think is replacing that tournament style event mode outside of the kind of pinnacle weapon chase. Once you've kind of got past the initial stuff they introduced in Forsaken, the title, the rewards, and any seasonal weapons, the PvP endgame isn't really highly investable. And I know probably at this point, PvP is more divisive than it ever has been, but nonetheless I do feel for players who have always mained PvP in Destiny. But there is a lot more we could talk about when it comes to the state of Destiny in general. But until more of Joker's Wild rolls out, I think we've addressed a lot of concerns. The interesting question is really how Bungie move forward, how they can approach content like the annual pass, because despite the mixed response here, it would be very difficult for Bungie to create a more kind of diverse palette of content for the same price without it all being very watered down inside of a drop like this. I think most of us can probably agree on that, and instead Bungie are focused into a component of Destiny, in this instance that not everybody absolutely loves, but they did focus into it pretty hard. So it does provide way more value for Gambit and its endgame than if Bungie half-baked 2 or 3 things into the game. But again, it does mean that some players aren't really motivated to play because of that content niche that we mentioned at the start of the video. On top of this right now, there are new games coming out, you know. We've played a lot of Destiny, and previously in D1, we would have extended content droughts, where for many months a lot of players would move away, play other games, and then return with the big content drops, which of course gives Bungie a larger time window to do those big innovative things that help to re-engage players, you know, for a couple of months potentially. So my next big question would be, for you guys who aren't really engaging in this season, do you see yourself coming back for Penumbra, or Season of Opulence as it's now called? I do wonder how many players genuinely feel like skipping a season, but still coming back when there's new stuff to do, versus players who for now don't necessarily plan to come back. I'd generally love to see where you guys stand on this one. The only other thing I would mention is that in terms of whether we should expect big stuff in Destiny's future, I think the answer is yes. And that's a kind of safe bet anyway, but we recently learned that Activision, since Bungie's split, have netted revenue of around $160 million, and this is revenue that comes as a direct result of that split, and a good chunk of this money will be the money that Bungie paid Activision in order to actually acquire the franchise in full. And yeah, we're probably talking, you know, getting on for $100 million at least, if not more, and the simple fact is that Bungie would only pay that kind of money if they intended for Destiny to continue to be a major franchise. And you know, while I'm sure they've made plenty of money on the annual pass, this is not what they spent many millions of dollars on. Bungie are clearly going to be launching major content in the form of big expansions, or indeed Destiny 3. So Destiny very much has a life cycle beyond the annual pass and what's happening right now. But guys, that is going to summarize my thoughts, my kind of response and reflecting on some of the stuff that's been spoken about in the community. I know this video has been kind of a long one, but it feels like there's so much ground to cover, so many different perspectives and interactions going on, you know, in the franchise, in the community. So I think it's interesting stuff. Let me know your thoughts, guys, but if you've enjoyed this rant, if you can call it anything other than that, a rating is very much appreciated below. If you're new to the channel and you enjoy the conversation, feel free to hit that subscribe button. But otherwise, thank you for tuning in, and I hope you have an awesome day.